This is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week, I spoke with psychologist, author, and activist Dan Dana. Dana earned his PhD in counseling psychology in 1977 and spent the next 25 years teaching and counseling patients. He also founded an educational business and even ran for Congress. Now retired, he's opened up about his atheism and wrote a book defending secular humanism, which just so happens to have the same title as this show, The Reason Revolution. Now retired, Dana uses his free time to share his ideas on atheism and advocating for a secular, democratic society. In our wide-ranging conversation, we talked about Dan's upbringing and his path to atheism, his love and dedication to science, his book, The Reason Revolution. Then we switched to politics. We talked a little bit about Donald Trump and his connection to evangelicals, the differences between liberals and conservatives, and the importance of secular humanism. So, here's my interview with Dan Dana. Dan Dana, how's it going, sir?
Very well. How are you, Justin?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
My pleasure.
So you have been an out atheist at least for 50 years, which is pretty cool. I've only been an out atheist for about 8. So
I think you're a bit younger than I am, too.
So that's pretty darn cool. And you are a psychologist, you're an activist, and you're an author of, I think, an excellent little 1-volume book called The Reason Revolution. So I like the fact that you like the same title that I did. Sort of great minds think alike. So,
yes.
How did you come to atheism? What was your upbringing like, and kind of what was your process of either losing religious belief or just becoming secular?
Okay, I was raised in a rural community on a farm, actually, in Missouri. And of course, my community was a Protestant Christian. And there was a small Methodist church in our community, just a couple of miles from where I grew up. And my family was fairly central to that. It was a small church. In fact, the town, if it can be called that the church was located in, had about 30 residents. So it was basically a farming community. So my mother was the pianist for the church, and her mother had been the pianist in that church before her. And my grandfather was the choir leader. So we were regular attendees and participants in the church. In fact, I was quite a good little Christian boy. I had a 6-year Sunday school pin, which I was very proud of because I had attended Sunday school without missing any sessions for 6 years. And that was probably from age 5 to 11, something like that. So in any case, I was very much immersed in that world. I think the first, I was rehearsing or reviewing kind of how this all happened because I haven't really articulated it for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. And when I was about maybe 14 years old, there was a boy who was, I think, the grandchild of another member of the community who came to visit the grandparents. And so he came to the church and we met. And prior to that time, I had never met an atheist. I never met anybody who was anything other than a Methodist, maybe a few Baptists sprinkled around. And so this was quite a new experience for me. So he somehow it came across in our conversation that he was not a believer. Mm-hmm. And I found that very intriguing because I guess by that time I'd already begun having my own questions. And by the way, he gave me a book, which I still have, and it's called Bertrand Russell's Best. It's a very short book of quotations from Bertrand Russell, who I'm sure you're aware is the British philosopher and mathematician, atheist of many, many years ago. In any case, I was reading this little book, and it just made so much sense to me. And it was just basically secularism. And so that piqued my interest. And the way my epistemological crisis, you might say, unfolded was it occurred to me that here we are Methodists, and a little distance from our home, there was a little Baptist church. And I thought, well, we Methodists, we think we're right, but those Baptists have a somewhat different belief, not a real different, mm-hmm. but they think they're right. So how do you know? How do you know for sure that you're right and they're wrong? But it wasn't a big difference, so it wasn't too troubling. But then it didn't take long for me to recognize that, well, in the county seat, in the town, the larger town closest to where we lived, there was a there was a Catholic church. Again, the Catholics are quite sure that they're right. But, we Protestants are quite sure that we're right. But how do you know? Because they're just as certain as I am. And then, of course, in the city, this was in the Kansas City area, I knew there was Jewish synagogues. And I thought, well, Jews and Christians are really different in their belief system. And so I didn't know much about it, but I knew it was different from what we were. And so I asked myself the epistemological question, how do I know? How does anyone be sure that they're right when there's other people who are just as sane, just as smart, well-educated, more so than I am, who have a very different belief on these matters? And then, of course, I also knew, even though I had at that time no exposure to it, that there were other religions in the world. There were Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and so on, who have very different beliefs from the ones that we had. So I was just really troubled by this notion that I couldn't be sure that my belief was right because other people were just as sure as I was, in fact, more so, that their belief system was right. So that was a very troubling idea. And so I eventually kind of came to the conclusion that, well, I'm an agnostic. So, you just can't know for sure. And so then I proceeded, and that kind of got me through high school. Then I went to University of Missouri as a freshman and in 1963. So if you're doing the math, I'm 72 now. And so I went to college, and there was some smart kids there, and I got exposed to science. And even though I wasn't a serious science student, I was a math major the first part of my undergraduate life. And so science gave an alternative way of understanding the world and how we know things. And so I became more and more agnostic in my belief. But I think it was probably by the time I was 18 or 20 that I finally said, I don't need to worry about this much longer. I'm actually an atheist. But in that world, in my family community, to admit that you're an atheist is like admitting that you're a serial killer. It's a terrible, terrible thing.
Yeah.
And so that kind of got me to that point. And then as my life went on, I got more interested in science and knowledgeable about science and how science is a way of knowing, and it's not just a matter of faith. That kind of settled it for me.
That's really cool. I became an out atheist around the same time you did. The only difference is if you transpose your numbers of age, that's my age. I'm 27.
Okay.
So your story is very similar to mine, in as much as that I came to atheism around the same time you did. I grew up non-religious. My parents were non-religious. Although I did grow up in Indiana and live in Indiana, I didn't have religion growing up. I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've been to church for actual religious reasons outside of like weddings or funerals or things like that. I think one of the things that's interesting is, I grew up in Indiana. You grew up in the Midwest too, to a certain extent. And one thing I think is that religion is sort of a given in the culture that we grew up in some respects, especially for you.
Yes.
And it's so hard, I think, for a lot of people to overcome that. And how did you kind of overcome that in your own way?
Well, it was somewhat traumatic. A piece of my story is that I was in high school in a small town, and we had a phys ed, physical education classes, and I remember distinctly there was this one occasion when I was kind of a nerdy kid to start with, kind of cerebral, and so I was out there playing in the outfield of our phys ed class. And that's where the non-athletic kids played that was their position. So I was out there kind of, pondering my questions. And in the middle of this ball game, it occurred to me as I was questioning my certainty about being a Methodist or a Baptist or then a Catholic or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever else, it occurred to me that I was on a slippery slope. And that the question that was ultimately coming to me, I was on the way to questioning whether or not there was a God, and how could I question that? And I remember being really terrified by that, because I just promised myself that I would not question that, the existence of God entirely, because again, being an atheist was a terrible thing. But it wasn't long before I just kind of succumbed to the pressure and realized, I do not know. There's no way to know. And I'll call myself an agnostic. I'm not ready to be an atheist yet, but I'll just be an agnostic. Mm-hmm. And then in that time, my mother's brother was actually a preacher in a small town, small church. He had been a farmer and kind of flunked out of farming, so he felt the call, I guess they call it, to become a minister in a Methodist church. Mm-hmm. And so I asked my mother about my questions, and she was very worried for me. And she said, well, you need to go talk to Uncle Bob. He'll know. So I actually went to talk to my Uncle Bob, the preacher, and he said, well, you just have to take it on faith. And that was unacceptable. Even at that age, it was unacceptable to be told that you just have to take this on faith with no evidence. And so that was, another turning point, that even the adults in my life at the time could not answer the question. They could not give me any reassurance that the belief system that my whole world, my whole community, as a kid, was immersed in was something you could be confident in being correct about. It was a slippery slope, and I finally fell off the edge.
Yeah, I feel very much the same way. When I was in college, I read a book that left a really big impact on me, and it was a book called Atheism, The Case Against God by George H. Smith. And it's still probably my favorite book on atheism, period. I absolutely love it. I reread it occasionally when I can. And he kind of set up that dichotomy about faith is basically pretending to know what you don't. That faith is a way to knowledge without the use of reason, which is impossible.
That's nice phrasing.
Yeah. And I pretty much agreed with him. And I felt like this was the way that I became an atheist. So it was like you said, sort of that epistemological change where you went away from this idea of maybe accepting faith as a possibility and then just recognizing, wait, faith is not a reliable way to truth. And it's not a reliable way to knowledge. And so that sort of destroyed all sort of notions of religion for me, at least intellectually. I kind of gave up on it completely.
Yeah. Well, so in my case, that kind of settled in my mind for the most part about whether or not there's a God, whether or not there's an afterlife, and all these other mythological ideas. And then that kind of submerged in a way as I proceeded into my career and went to college, and then I was teaching for a while, and then I developed a practice, a small business around mediation as an application of psychology, and that can be another conversation. It did not feel safe to admit or reveal my atheism. I would be very explicit about science and behavioral science in particular in my field as a foundational assumption, or I shouldn't say assumption, a foundational method of knowing what we know about it in my specific ways that psychology is applied to human condition. But I did not really talk to people about my atheism, except for, close friends. But even my family of origin did not fully understand or fully realize how far off the edge I had fallen. And so I was kind of in the closet for most of my life. Mm-hmm. 5 years ago, I retired. I no longer had clients I need to be worried about. I didn't any longer have students that I might offend and associates. And so I kind of came out of the closet, and I moved to Sarasota, Florida, where I live now, about 5 years ago. And I sought out a community of people who were secular. And there's a little group here called the Humanists of Sarasota Bay. And so they had weekly meetings and monthly meetings. And so I went to that group. My wife and I both did that. And that is now the center, you might say, of my social life.
That's great.
Who are explicitly atheistic, secular humanists. And so in a sense, I found my intellectual home, or my worldview home, at a late age.
That's fantastic. There's a very similar community where I live that's connected to the Center for Inquiry. There's a Center for Inquiry Indianapolis. which is run by a wonderful woman named Reba Boyd Wooden, who's been in the atheist secular humanist movement for probably 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. Yeah, probably closer to 20 years. Yeah, when she started the Indianapolis Humanists, and then it became CFI. And we have social events there as well. And that's, I think, the thing that's really great about organizations like CFI Indy or for you in Sarasota, that one of the things I think a lot of people who leave religion desire is a sense of community and a sense of fellowship with like-minded people, and a sense of I'm not alone, and there are other people like me. And so I've always found that the secular organizations that offer social events are just a wonderful thing to have, because I think that with a lot of times, a lot of people talk about, well, what about all the good that religion does and things like that, And I always argue back to them that on some level, yeah, they do a lot of good, but it's not good they couldn't do without religion. They could do all of it without religion. And so, one of the things that I think animates me is to try to find ways to build, circles of communities and activism that sort of unites those sort of principles. And it seems like that's very similar to the message of some of your activism as well.
Yeah, the Humanists of Sarasota Bay, Huss Bay is what the sort of short term for it is, in fact, we had our weekly meeting today for lunch.
Great.
But it's not really about atheism. It's just about things that the group might find interesting.
Of course.
So and our presenters are always members of our group. We don't have outside speakers.
Well, that's
cool.
So
today it was a friend who was a retired physician who did a very interesting presentation on the intestinal biome. Very informative. And I've done a presentation there on a couple of things. And so it's just a group of bright, well-educated, retired people. I'm probably among the youngest of the people in the group, who range up to the late 90s in age.
Oh, wow.
Old people.
That's cool. That's really cool, though.
But everybody's retired. Nobody's worrying about their careers. Nobody's worried about their financial situation. No, they're not trying to move up in the world.
Yeah.
So just people with a lot of knowledge and background who can speak about subjects that are not necessarily about atheism, because that's kind of a given.
Of course.
Nobody is uncertain about that. And another thing that we are aligned about is liberalism. So there's one fellow there who seems to be kind of on the fence about Trump, but everyone else is very opposed to Trump and pretty vocally in opposition to him.
We've got one guy with CFI who's like that too. He's a gentleman who his main central thing that he says about Trump is like, well, everybody's always criticizing him. Everybody's always giving him so much trouble. They're not giving him time to succeed or whatever. And I'm thinking like, I think we gave him, a year and a half on the campaign, and now he's been president for nearly a year. I feel like we have enough time to make a judgment call.
He's had enough time to prove himself, and he's failed miserably.
Exactly. So let's move on to talk about your book, because that was kind of how we came together. Was I remember when I was working on developing a new podcast, and I was trying to figure out what my name of my show was going to be. And I'd done a couple before that. And I love alliterative titles. I think alliterative titles are great. So I was looking around and I sort of had an aha moment of Reason Revolution. And then I go to Twitter and I realized I felt bad because I kind of aped the title from you. And so I saw that you had written a book called The Reason Revolution. And so it's an excellent little book. I read it earlier this week. I think it's great. I've had another guest on, an author named Kevin Davis, who's written an excellent little book that's very similar to yours, but your book is like talking about atheism and activism for atheists in some respects. And then his book is called Understanding an Atheist, and it's basically kind of understanding atheism and secularism for Christians. It's written for like the families of people who are religious. So and they're both about the same length. So I think they're lovely companion pieces. So I guess my question is, what was the impetus behind writing The Reason Revolution, and what are some of the overall sort of, or some of the bigger topics that you hit on in the book, and then we can go more in depth with that as we go along?
Okay. Well, the book, as you know, is about 8,000 words, and it's only an ebook. It's not been published in paper, and it's free on Amazon. I don't need to make any money on that. And so my impetus to do it was I think maybe two purposes. One is just to articulate my own position and to give the science-based argument for a secular worldview. So to debunk creationism, to debunk the notion of a deity, to debunk the notion of a sentient afterlife, and so on. So I wanted to just articulate, after maybe decades of being in the closet, what in fact I think. And so one purpose of it was to offer to others who might be questioning an argument for secularism. The second purpose was to make a case for separation of church and state, to get religion out of government. Because that's, it doesn't really matter to me what an individual believes. I do not have arguments with people about religion or about whether or not there's a God or an afterlife or any of those questions. It doesn't matter to me, what someone might believe. What does matter to me, though, is if they vote and they support policies or candidates who are trying to advance a theocracy or a rules and regulations and policies and so on that are rooted either directly or indirectly in religious ideas. So I'm kind of a stickler about separation of church and state. So that little book was a way to make the case that, and you might recall there's a section in it about how religious notions are infused in policies that the government has, or at least many people advocate. And that's what if I'm activist at all, and as I mentioned to you before we spoke, I think it's an overstatement to call me an activist. I simply am an atheist who wrote a little book, and I vote liberal and vote secular, but I don't attend conferences. I don't really know many people in the field. I don't really read much anymore about that. My interests have moved on. So my personal reading entertainment is in cosmology. It just fascinates me, what the universe is like and so on. So that's where my personal interests have led. And it's been a few years since I really read anything new on atheism. It's kind of a settled issue for me, so it's not a personal burning question, and it's not a career or even an avocation for me.
Right on. I would say in some respects that, the fact that you've written, I think, such a lovely, concise, very well articulated piece of atheist literature, that qualifies you as an activist in my book. I mean, in some respects, I'm not like my buddy Justin Scott, who is the president of Eastern Iowa Atheists. He's very politically active. And we've always described it in the atheist movement broadly. There's sort of, I think most people fall sort of into two camps. And obviously there are exceptions, but most fall sort of into two camps. You have thought leaders and foot soldiers. My buddy Justin Scott, sort of a foot soldier. He's somebody who goes out and gives secular invocations at, city council meetings and writes op-eds for the local paper, and he helps get people elected, and he does a lot of on the ground activism. And then there are thought leaders, and that's me. I don't do a lot of that stuff, but I'm a podcaster, I'm an author, I write blogs, I've written a master's thesis on Robert Ingersoll. And I do YouTube stuff. And so that's what I do. I'm a content creator. And so in that regard, I would say with you sort of fall in the same camp I do. You're a thought leader. You're somebody who put out material that is sort of some of the really great sort of universal guiding principles for secular people that can then be implemented by people. So that's kind of how I look at it. So let's back up just a sec and talk a little bit about some of the ways in which you're bothered by religious intrusions in government, because that's one of the things that unites me too, is that I feel the thing that worries me the most is theocracy and sort of the encroaching theocracy in this country that I see a lot. Even though the non-religious part of this country is growing by leaps and bounds, we still see so much theocratic stuff in our government. And if you could just kind of sum up for me in some respects, kind of some of the things that you're bothered by that theocracies, or not theocracies, but that people who are sort of theocrats in government, that they often try to do.
Sure. Well, and just along those lines, there's 535 members of Congress, the Senate and the House, and all but one, as far as I know, are theocrats. That is, they're religious. Mm-hmm. Now, I think they're really not, but it's political suicide for an elected member of Congress to be an open atheist.
Yeah.
There was one fellow in California, I forget his name, who was an acknowledged atheist, and he was not reelected. And there's just this pressure on public figures to at least appear to be religious, even though underneath it they're not. So in any case, the result of that is, of course, that everybody's playing to their base, and the base is presumed to be Christian, or at least religious. And so they have to, support policies that are rooted in religion. So a couple of the issues where religion and religious ideas, primarily Christian ideas, are infused in the policy is the whole issue about abortion rights and contraceptive rights and so on. That is obviously, there's no basis for restricting access to contraception or access to safe abortions, other than religious objections, which are invalid from, I think, our point of view. Mm-hmm. Another is that churches are tax exempt, and so they use public money for their services, for their fire department and their police protection and all that, but they don't pay any taxes. And it seems to me that that's, that we, the general public, including we secular people, are subsidizing churches and religious activities. And I object to that. Another one that has become popular in my community here in Sarasota of older people is the right to die question. And of course, most people think that, well, that's not your right. You don't get to die when you want to. You have to wait for natural death. And the most progressive part of that issue now is that having physician-assisted suicide, which is in just a few states, I think Oregon, Washington, California, if I'm not mistaken, accept physician-assisted death. And I'm a little bit more radical about that. It seems to me that I can imagine myself, hopefully not in the next 20, 25 years, but I could imagine myself being in a situation where I may not be terminally ill, but I'm in a situation in which I do not want to continue to live. Mm-hmm. A friend of a friend was recently, and he was a man about my age, I think, was in a car accident, and he's paralyzed from the neck down. Well, I would not want to live unable to function. Mm-hmm. I'm sure about that. And so as of now, it would be illegal for me, if I were even physically capable of ending my life in some nonviolent, peaceful, painless way. It would be illegal for me to do that. And it would be illegal for anyone who loved me enough to help me to do that. So the whole issue around how life is considered to be sacred, and that we don't have the right to end it if circumstances are such that we would choose to do that. As far as I'm concerned, that's a personal choice. The church does not own my life. The government doesn't own my life. The state doesn't own my life. And in fact, even the medical profession doesn't own my life. I can use healthcare practitioners, physicians, and so on for my care, but they don't have the right to tell me whether I can choose to die or not. So that's something that, as older people in Sarasota progress toward advanced age and perhaps ill health or disability, that's something that we uniformly agree about here. And it's refreshing, even though it might seem like a morbid subject to younger people. For us old folks, it's just kind of a reality that we don't spend time being depressed about. but it's just a reality that, we've lived most of our lives, and we want to be able to, when the time to die comes, we want to have choice about how to do that.
I completely agree with you. It's, even though I'm much younger or whatever, I'm actually very passionate about this issue too. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that I've had members of my family who, suffered needlessly for years with ailments that had they had the choice would have probably taken the choice to have aid in dying. And I think what you've described here is the religious sort of encroachments on personal choices. I'm so glad you brought up aid in dying, because I think it's very relevant when discussing our brand new Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch,
right.
Who was appointed by Donald Trump and confirmed by the Senate earlier this year, and was only confirmed because of Mike Pence's tie-breaking vote. And for those across America, I'm sorry for Mike Pence. He comes from my neck of the woods. I'm sorry. But one of the big things about Neil Gorsuch, one of the strongest views that he has, is that he's strongly against aid in dying. And in fact, he wrote an entire book, which I think was actually his PhD or his J-Law dissertation before he, wrote it into a book, strongly arguing against physician-assisted suicide or aid in dying. And so now he is a permanent member in the court, and he's only in his mid-50s, so he's likely to be on the court 20 or even 30, 35 years. So the choices of politicians have an immense impact on the kind of decisions that people are allowed to make, especially ones that are religious. And Gorsuch is certainly more of a Christian conservative on the court. I mean, he replaced Scalia. And Trump chose him because he was sort of an heir apparent to Scalia. So, that's kind of my segue, I guess, to talk a little bit about Trump. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Trump, and where do you think sort of secularists or liberals, where do you think we have opportunities to sort of fight back against Trump and some of the theocratic things he wants to do?
He's a mystery. Well, I'll start to say he's a mystery, but actually not so much of a mystery. It's just he's a wannabe dictator.
Yeah.
And I don't think he just exploits a base of people, what Hillary called the deplorables, and I think that was actually a descriptive, accurate remark about. She said half of his supporters are deplorables, and the other half are simply ignorant.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
In the case Trump, I'm quite sure is not personally religious. In fact, he's probably an atheist, but I don't want to claim him among us.
Yep, I've said that too. I don't want to claim him either.
He's the worst atheist I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Barack Obama, I'm quite confident, is actually an atheist. But of course, he couldn't admit that because that would be, political suicide. But, his mother was atheist, and he was not raised in a church, and so anyway, Obama is a hero of mine. I just love the guy.
Likewise,
in every way.
I worked for his campaign in 2008, and he was a big part of my own sort of political consciousness, and I think he was a truly great president, and I think that he was unfairly challenged in a lot of ways, but I do think he was a great president. So I'm totally with you on that.
Okay, good. Well, and I find that almost everybody in my secular world here agrees. Obama is greatly admired by everyone I know, and Trump is hated by everyone I know. I was in a discussion group. There's kind of a spin-off group from this humanist group I mentioned earlier of maybe 10 people that meet on a different day of the week. In fact, it's once a month that we meet and have lunch and chat. And we're all very vocal about our opposition to Trump. And I was making a comment to the group, and I said, I think that no one here hates Trump as much as I do. And everyone's hands went up. They wanted to compete with me about intense or disapproval or hatred. I don't like to use that word, but or contempt for Trump. So in terms of political action, I guess my hope is that the Mueller investigation can quickly establish that he's criminal in ways that cannot escape impeachment.
Yeah, we just had that information earlier today about how Mueller, I believe, is subpoenaing Deutsche Bank for information regarding Trump and his ties to Russia, alleged ties to Russia. I don't want someone coming after me, although wink.
Right.
But yeah. So I do think, especially after the Flynn indictment, the fact that Flynn, from what I understand, Flynn was indicted on multiple charges, but then took a plea deal to have one. So the mere fact that he took a plea deal to only have one charge to be convicted of or whatever speaks to the fact that he knows something, and that I think that the investigation is certainly not over. And regardless of however that turns out, although I hope that Mueller has a Christmas gift for us in a few weeks, that'd be great. But he is easily one of the most. He is one of the most corrupt presidents, if not the most corrupt president in modern history.
Yes, certainly the most corrupt. I cannot imagine. I'm not a presidential historian, but with all the presidents that have been, I don't think there's anyone in history of this country who has been as corrupt and as dangerous to our institutions of governance. The media. I've come to appreciate the essential function of a free media.
Of course.
And so his attacks on the so-called fake news, and the Fox people are stepping in to be his vehicle, the propaganda arm of the Republican Party. So it's just his attacks on the judiciary, on the State Department, on diplomacy, and on the media and other institutions of government are truly dangerous.
I completely agree. There's a fundamental lack of respect for institutions, which is one of the things that very much bothers me about him. Part of my liberalism is a strong sense of institutionalism. I believe institutions matter. Political institutions, economic institutions, media institutions. And I think that they serve essential functions for the flourishing of a society. And when you have someone at the top who's constantly sort of chipping away at the integrity of these institutions, it casts doubt on the society as a whole, and it's unnecessary doubt. So that it leads us to a situation where voters are constantly unhappy with the institutions because they're being told that they should be unhappy with them, even if they actually do a lot of good. And it leads us into a position where every 4 or 8 years, the voters are constantly like, vote the bastards out, vote the bastards out, or as Trump described it, drain the swamp. But that's not really what's happening. I mean, if you look at his cabinet, if you look at his political positions, if you look at what he actually does, he's just reaffirming the swamp. He's doubling down on the swamp.
It's making it worse.
Yeah, I think so. So I guess with that in mind, my next question for you is, why do you think evangelicals specifically, because 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump last year. That's a higher percentage than even George W. Bush got in the 2004 election, which I couldn't imagine that being any higher. But he got 81%. Why do evangelicals like Trump so much?
That is a real mystery, because he's obviously not modeling Christian behavior. he's not a follower of Jesus. So his sexual assaults and disrespect toward women. When he stepped off the bus and made those comments, Access Hollywood.
Yeah.
We all thought, well, that's the end of Trump. You just can't survive that with the Republican Party and the religiosity of the Republican Party, and somehow they got excused. And now the Roy Moore fellow in Alabama, the Christian conservatives or the evangelicals are all behind him. It is truly a mystery to me about how they're able to reconcile this cognitive dissonance, how they're able to somehow reconcile these two incompatible views, or incompatible positions. One is, supporting Trump, supporting Roy Moore and other nasty people, and, the allegedly humanitarian and Jesus-like beliefs of evangelicalism. It's a mystery. I've never been my family, we're kind of mainstream Christian, Protestant Christian. I was not around evangelicals. So in my generation, evangelicalism did not exist when I was a kid. That came along sometime later, and I was way out of the fold by that time.
Yeah.
So I really don't have much insight into how evangelicals can reconcile their version of Christianity with the conduct of this guy that is so unchristian in any sense that I've ever understood that term.
Yeah, and in many ways, I'm with you. I guess for a few months, my main thinking has been, and I just didn't think that these people operated this way, but there's a part of me that kind of thinks that they do, that my conjecture as to why they've sort of glommed onto Trump in the way that they did was that it was sort of a realpolitik self-interest kind of thing where Trump said all the right things for them to be happy. So whether it was... Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to get rid of the Johnson Amendment. I'm going to put a conservative on the court. I'm going to try to peel back Roe v. Wade. I'm going to try to repeal this. I'm going to try to do that. And that hit all the right buttons for those people. So even if... And what's interesting, too, is that I think polling data showed this recently. It may have been PRRI or it might have been Pew, that when it comes to a person's personal conduct versus their public lives, that currently some of the most conservative voters are actually more comfortable with people who are sort of personally problematic, but publicly give them what they want, and right. Which is, I think, very, very interesting. But my argument, I think I've said for a while, is basically the reason that they love him so much is because he is willing to do for them what very few Republican presidents that they've sort of supported over the years have been able to actually do. Right. So, for example, his decision this week about Jerusalem and trying to move the official capital of Jerusalem from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that is something that conservative presidents in some respects have always sort of hinted they might do, but they never did because it was really harmful to sort of international relations and would kind of destabilize the region. But Trump doesn't really seem to give a shit about that. So he's more willing to give people what they want. And so that's why they support him. I think Roy Moore is the same way. That's my conjecture, but I mean, we'll kind of see how that plays out.
Yeah, I agree with nearly everything he said, that he made promises which he knew at the time, I believe, were lies. I mean, there's some conjecture about his psychiatric condition as to whether he believes some lies or not.
Yeah,
he lied to his base out there about what he's going to do, which appeared to be in their interest. But of course, he's done the exact opposite. So this tax proposal is very harmful to the very people who voted for him. And so it's kind of mind-boggling. One of the aspects of the Trump phenomenon is that he does not view himself as the leader of the country. He's entirely self-serving. Whatever can make him look good and get him more attention and give him more money is all he cares about. And so being the president is just a vehicle for aggrandizing himself and enriching himself. So even other Republican presidents, I was very critical of George W. Bush, but in retrospect, he was he was a saint compared to, pardon the expression, compared to Trump, because he was actually a leader of the country. He viewed himself as being the leader, and he wanted to act responsibly to further the interests of the country. But I don't trust Trump to be doing that. So he's endangering people and endangering the country with moves like his announcement yesterday about moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And his behavior toward North Korea is very frightening. And I can imagine that the guy would start a nuclear war as a distraction against, his the investigation against him. It's just a mind-boggling trade-off that I can't imagine anybody else ever doing. It's just insane.
I agree. And one of the things that bothers me a lot is that the longer he's around and the longer that he's president and the longer that we put up with this, the more and more it's normalized. The more and more that like people just accept, oh, well, that's Trump. And I even find myself doing that because you can only be pissed off so much before you kind of break. And the thing I think that really upsets me the most is the fact that he has little to no regard. I would say almost no regard for norms of governance, norms of diplomacy, norms of the presidency. He has no respect for them, which really bothers me. And like you said, you can say what you will about George W. Bush. I was no fan. I came to political consciousness as a teenager during the Bush years, and I remember just truly how bad his presidency was. It was a nightmare. But the difference between him and Trump is that Bush at least understood on some level that there are norms to the presidency, there are norms to institutions, there are norms to international relations, that there are certain things you can and cannot do. And even when he violated them on some level, his administration, if they didn't acknowledge or own the fact that they made mistakes, they at least, I think, understood them. And that's, I think, the thing that really bothers me about Trump is it's not just that he's asleep at the wheel. It's as if he's like this like drunken slob who's decided to just completely pass out in the car with a whole bunch of people in the car telling him how wonderful a driver he is. And that's what scares me. The fact that there was a report that came out earlier this summer about how national security briefings that are given to Trump are peppered with his name so that they notice that the more and more his name is in national security briefings, the more he'll tend to read. Because he's that self-obsessed. That's a scary notion.
Well, I was going to insert in your comment there that the diagnosis that has been made by various folks who are more clinically oriented than I am is malignant narcissism. He's so self-absorbed, and it's dangerous. It's not just, hey, look at me, I'm great. He will just trample on anybody who opposes him in a very inhumane way. I'm not finding the right words for this, but it's scary.
It very much is, and it sort of is sad to me because as a person who sort of, I worked on Obama's first campaign. I voted for him twice. I supported him as president, and it's just sad to know that like his presidency, that the bookend of it, one of the bookends of it is Trump. And it speaks volumes about the nature of, it's what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the cycles of American history, where we go one way and then we go another, and we kind of go one way and we go another. But the difference this time around was it seemed to me like people had no compunction about the fact that Trump was truly awful. I think people had a lot of criticism of Clinton, and they sort of felt like it was like a lesser of two evils, even though it was not really the case. And so because of that, it led us into a situation where he became president. Now, mind you, that a lot of that is to do with the fact that 80,000 people in like 3 states voted for him, and that tipped the balance. I mean, he didn't win the popular vote, but
it's still considered an influence. I really have no doubt that Putin put him in office. He's an illegitimate president. He would not have won had it not been for the influence of the Russians.
I think that's a fair point, particularly with respect to social media. If you look at, there were hearings, I think, on Capitol Hill recently about how there are a lot of these sort of what they call dark ads on Facebook, and how a lot of these were paid for with Russian money and were done by Russians, and you had a lot of Russian bots on Twitter. And not to mention the fact that you had the huge leak of documents that happened in the summer during the week of the DNC. I agree with you in a lot of ways that the problem that I have is the fact that the fact that he is president, and the fact that he has such overt, they're not even covert, overt ties to Russia should make people so fundamentally pissed that he's president. And it just seems to me like there's a huge disconnect between sort of liberals and moderates and conservatives. Like liberals and a lot of independents or moderates, they look at this situation and they see what it is. and how really damaging it is to the country, but yet conservatives don't. It speaks a lot to our tribalism.
Right, right. And outside of this country, it's an absolute puzzlement about how it is that America, who is thought to be filled with some reasonably bright, well-educated people, elected this guy. Now, I was recently in Australia for a couple of weeks, about 2 months ago, and you could just speak freely about Trump in very critical terms, and everybody agrees with you. There's no Trump supporters outside this country, except perhaps in Israel for very particular reasons, because of the Israeli political situation.
Or far-right fascists in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. But in Australia, it was a delightful.
I bet.
And they understand the way that you and I understand, and most of us understand how this happened.
Yeah.
Anomaly. But it's just a mind-boggling occurrence that we have this guy running what is ostensibly the most powerful country in the world and the leader of the world. But I think we've lost it. China is the next century, and the U.S. with Trump's assistance has lost its place as or will soon lose its place if we have more Trumpism as the leader of the world.
Yeah, and that's sort of the bitter irony in it all, because his whole thing was about make America great again, America first. Let's, the Chinese are robbing us blind, and all this kind of nationalistic arguments, and yet at every turn he makes constant decisions that undermine our status as a global power. Whether it's pulling out of the Paris Agreement, which now we are the only country. Syria signed on to the Paris Agreement, the only country not in the Paris Agreement. He's the first president in American history to make national landmarks of land smaller, or at least attempt to make them smaller.
Right. You're obviously a very thoughtful and bright and well-informed person.
Thank you.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
That I don't have a good answer to.
Yeah.
We start talking about atheism, and there's such a concordance. Atheists are almost uniformly socially liberal and anti-Trump. There's just this one guy that's in our atheist group here in Sarasota who was kind of on the fence about Trump. He speaks a little bit defensively about Trump. He's the only person I've met among many, many, many who are atheists. The atheists are social liberals and political liberals. Why is that? How do you answer the question of why atheists are liberals?
So I guess, as somebody who studies, I'm an historian by profession, and I study late 19th century secularism and free thought, and I sort of study the rise of American free thought during that period, and particularly people like Robert Ingersoll and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, that I've always associated sort of free thought, freedom of expression, freedom of ideas with political liberalism. And that's in the broadest sense possible. And I think the reason for that is for a few things. One, the fact that we're in such, I guess, in some respects, a minority position, being, atheists or secularists, I think underscores how important we view individual rights. That individual rights are something that we very much care about, and freedom of expression, freedom of ideas, and just by and large, and I know this is going to sound a little pithy, but I just think it's honest. Liberals tend to be better educated. We tend to be better educated. We tend to read more. We tend to have conversations about these things far more than conservatives do. And, I'm not saying that like conservatives are dumb or anything like that. I'm just saying like on par, if you look at overall, the higher an educational attainment, the higher the degree to which someone is a liberal. And if you look at people who are atheists, people who are non-religious, they tend to be the most educated part of the populace. So it's no surprise to me that on some level, we're going to just be more liberal, because that just coincides with being, I think, a more well-read, better educated, more enlightened populace. Now, I know I'll probably get an email about this, and some conservative will give me crap, and that's fine. I'm talking about averages. I'm not talking about individual people. But that's really why I think it's the case, is that I just think that we as atheists, we just tend to be, on the whole, a little bit, I just would say, we tend to just be better educated. And I think that just leads to being more liberal.
Yeah, well, I agree. These are sort of self-serving observations, of course, but I think they're true.
Yeah.
And there's something psychological. I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time since I was in graduate school and learned some of these terms. But there's a psychological dimension where people see things as black and white, right or wrong, dichotomous thinking, whereas others, the opposite is, see things in an integrative way, like two things can be thought about as being two aspects or two views of the same problem, two different sides of the same elephant. And it seems like the right-wingers are more prone to black and white thinking. And liberals, and I would agree, brighter people, just in social intelligence, if not educational levels, are able to kind of see multiple sides of the same question. So Obama, for example, he had a team of rivals like Lincoln did. And he brings in people who aren't, who don't agree with him. And he learned from that. He was able to kind of get the best of all kinds of ideas, and he didn't just fight and destroy the opposition. So and that's another factor here is how Republicans are gun owners. You see, they like the idea, if not the actual practice, of having a gun for self-protection and for defense against the bad guys. I mean, I don't own a gun. I was in the Army. In fact, I was in Vietnam back in the 60s. Not as a combat soldier, but as, I was there for my year. And so I have some exposure to people that do guns for a living. And I've never been hunting. I've never owned a gun. I've never shot a gun except when I was in training in the Army back in 1966 and 67. And yet, there's millions of these AK-47 assault rifles that are purchased in this country. And that's another national embarrassment.
Yeah.
And I would guess that virtually every one of them is a right wing on the political scale.
Yeah. I mean, so, in terms of my upbringing, I haven't shot a gun in probably over a decade. My dad owns guns. My dad's a hunter. I grew up with hunting and went hunting with my dad and things like that when I was like 10, 11, 12. But it never really appealed to me. It was never really my thing. So I just don't feel a connection to it, but it's something that was a part of the culture I grew up in the Midwest in some respects. I guess what I want to say alongside what you've talked about with in terms of like openness to experience or the fact that, conservatives tend to be very black, white in thinking, whereas liberals, we tend to be more pragmatic, which I do think is the case. In many ways, I look at Obama as being like the ultimate pragmatist. He was constantly, I think, pragmatic to the chagrin of a lot of liberals. I do think he was pragmatic, which I like about a politician. I like pragmatism. I think that's good. And Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, has written a book that's excellent called The Righteous Mind. And it's all about why people are divided by politics and religion. And one of the things he talks about is you can tell a lot about a person's political views by what they value morally. So with liberals or people who either sort of center left or left, they tend to value sort of liberty, equality, and security. Those are the big moral things that they really care about. Those are the things that unite them. Whereas conservatives, they tend to have a wider moral palette politically, where they care about liberty, they care about equality a lot less, and they care about security a lot. But they also care about things like authority, and particularly sacredness, which is another component to what Haidt talks about, and sort of traditionalism, the idea of sort of conserving how they are. And liberals tend to not do very well on sort of the traditionalism and the sacredness aspects of it, but conservatives do very, very well. And he talks about the fact that because conservatives tend to have such a very wide moral palette, they do better in elections because the elections are based a lot more on sort of moral intuitions rather than sort of policy choices. And that's always been, I think, a challenge that liberals have had, is that we often, what we want to do doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. We can't articulate it in a sentence always. It takes a paragraph or it takes a page of material. And that's, I think, a way of sort of looking at it too, that the way someone is sort of morally intuitive also plays into their politics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really like your wording. You're obviously current on ideas and writings related to this subject of conversation.
Thank you. You were talking earlier about a lot of the reading that you do these days is about cosmology, which I think is super cool. I'm a huge Carl Sagan fan, and I love that you brought up Sagan in your book. But the stuff that I read a lot is psychology. I'm obsessed with what makes people tick and how we organize societies and how people are different. So, I just recently read Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, which is really, really great. Jonathan Haidt's book's really good too. So those are the kind of things I'm obsessed with. And so they just to try to understand Trump, and understand Trumpism and understand what's going on in the country. I was just after the election, I was like, what can I read that will help me understand this moment? And so I just went to the internet and just was like, okay, what books are people suggesting for me to understand what's going on? People constantly said Haidt's books. That's why I read it. But to kind of finish up our conversation, the one last thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is secular humanism. And that's really what I advocate for. I know it's what you advocate for. What is secular humanism to you? And this is sort of a three-part question. What is secular humanism to you? Why do you think it's important, and how can we use it to sort of make our country better?
Wow, that could go on a while.
Sure.
Well, in a definitional sense, secular to me, of course, means non-religiosity. That is, you take a science-based view of the world, so that excludes mysticism in all its forms, supernaturalism, and so on. So that's the secular part. The humanism is just caring about the well-being of sentient creatures, humans and others, who have the capacity for pain and pleasure. So from my point of view, I have a science-based view of the universe and my minuscule part in it, my infinitesimally small part of it, and that's just fine with me. Mm-hmm. I'm happy as a pig in poop, as we said back on the farm. For the little bundle of molecules temporarily called Dan to be conscious. And so I oftentimes sit and watch the sunset from my window with a glass of wine and some nice music and just marvel on the incredible accidental nature of my existence. It's the opposite of grandiosity. I revel in the meaninglessness, you might say, of my little moment in time and space. And just my good fortune in being able to be conscious. So that's I guess that's part of my secular humanism. So the most important thing I can do in life is to contribute somewhat to the well-being of other people. My wife, who is just my best friend, I've said to her and to many people that, there's no purpose in my life any greater than contributing to the quality of her life. And there's no higher purpose than that, and that's just fine with me. So that kind of captures perhaps the secular humanism aspect of it. Now, how we can proceed with that and make that a political movement or a broader influence on the well-being of the world. I believe in democracy, that we somehow can overcome the irrationality of voting. It's irrational in the sense that there's never been a national election in which one person's vote made the difference. So in reality, any one of us could just sort of stay home on election day, and the outcome of the election would be the same. Yet, if everybody felt that way, then democracy would fall apart. So somehow we all have to join together in the illusion that my vote counts and go do our duty. So I was discussing this with a group the other day, and it was somewhat contentious. It was part of the humanist group, and so I was arguing that it's irrational to vote because you're just bothering to vote and it will not make a difference. However, the reason I vote is to feel good about participating in democracy and just having my voice, voice and choice and an outcome. Mm-hmm. So just extending the vote. In Australia, voting is mandatory. There's a penalty if you don't vote. And that has the side benefit of people being informed better than we are in this country. So we have like a 35 to 40% voter turnout, mm-hmm. and many of the voters simply are not informed about the issues. And that's a big drag on the effectiveness of democracy in this country. So I guess just, and then trying to clean up elections so that we don't have contaminating influences like fake news and Russian money, and for that matter, American money. You know, the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court was one of the worst decisions ever. That allows money to you know, they say money is a vote. So it's, or maybe going far afield from your closing question, but secular humanism to me is a worldview that is morally right. It's good because it's beneficial to people, whether it's your immediate family and people you immediately care about, or the broader country or the broader world. So in a sense, I'm kind of a global citizen. Mm-hmm. I'm one of 7 billion people on this planet, and I don't have much influence on the overall scheme of things. But it feels good to be a constructive part of the effort. That's, in a sense, my reason for being.
That's great. It reminds me of that lovely quote by Thomas Paine that I'm like something along the lines of, "I'm a citizen of the world, and to do good is my religion." And I feel very much the same way. That you know, I really like the fact that you emphasize the notion of democracy, because that's something that I think is really important with humanism, is liberal democracy. And in that regard, I feel like one of the worries that I have currently about the world, and particularly in the United States, is this sort of rise of authoritarianism and the retreat of democracy, that democracy is retreating. And I'm very worried about that as a prospect. So I think one of the values of advocating for secular humanism is advocating for those broadly liberal values of democracy and openness and freedom and tolerance that I think are so important. And I think that that's the way to sort of make our world better. Because I wrote a piece recently about how the beauty about humanism is that it's not much of an ism at all. It's so broad that within its sort of general concepts, a lot of different lifestyles and a lot of different viewpoints can flourish in this sort of marketplace of ideas. I think that's what I look forward to, because I'm like you. What a person's individual beliefs are about religion don't necessarily concern me that much. What concerns me more is when those ideas are then put into policies and then they start influencing me. That's when I have a huge problem. Yeah.
Well, we are co-travelers, Justin.
Thank you.
On this road of life, and I'm a few decades ahead of you, but we're very much in congruent thinking and caring about the world.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's a wonderful way to cap it off. Dan, how can people get your book?
Well, it's on Amazon. It's a Kindle. It's an ebook. Mm-hmm. So it's Amazon, and if you look up Reason Revolution, or just look at my name, just Dana and atheism, and you'll find all of that. And if you go to the web page, I have links to several other articles that I've written, and the web page is dandana.us/atheism. And so there's links there to several things, including the Reason Revolution book and some other articles. Wonderful.
And I'll make sure to include those links in the show notes as well. Dan, thank you so much for taking time tonight to speak with me. This has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion.
It sure is, Justin. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to kind of get to know you.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you so much again for coming on. Have a great night.
You too. Good night.
And that was my conversation with Dan Dana. To download his book, the link is in the description box. That's it for Reason Revolution this week. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, and now Google Play. We're on Google Play now as well. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know, and I'll try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. Also, go give our Facebook page a like at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. We're almost to 500 likes. Go over there and give us a like. We'd really appreciate it. Visit our brand new website, reasonrevolution.org, to keep up on all episodes, blogs, and additional content. There's a new blog up there that I wrote about Sam Harris, the moral landscape, and its connections to utilitarianism. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. Until next week, This has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.